So good morning and good afternoon and welcome to today's Captive Review Virtual Symposium on Healthcare. I hope everyone watching is safe and well. For those of you who don't know, I'm Lauren Ingram and I'm the editor of Captive Review. So for today's symposium, we're partnering with Spring Consulting to bring you a panel talking about healthcare and captives. And given the current state of the world, I think it's a very topical subject and that everyone will have a lot to contribute on this. Before I introduce the panel, let me just talk about there is some housekeeping. So if you've attended one of our symposiums before, you'll know we use the website Slido to let you submit questions. So if you go to slido.com and put in captive virtual, you can vote. If you can put in your questions for everyone at the end. So now I want to introduce our moderator, Julie Bordeaux, who is the President and General Manager of PCH Mutual Insurance Co. RRG. And she's going to lead us into this. So thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you, Lauren. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this, what promises to be a very informative symposium. We have a wealth of knowledge and experience on the panel, and we really appreciate you taking time this morning in these challenging times to learn more about what's going on in healthcare. My background is with a group captive, an RRG, that has over 1,700 member insureds in the long-term care space. So we've been facing a lot of the challenges with the pandemic right now. But importantly, I'd like to turn this over to our panel. And the first topic we're going to address is crisis management and increasing pressure on the healthcare systems and healthcare. And so Christy, I'd really like to start with you on this one. You're integral to the University of California captive operations that span both healthcare and the academic setting. Can you tell us some ways that UC responded to the crisis?
I can, thanks, Julie. The university is such a diverse enterprise that we responded in every way imaginable. Our academic campuses are similar to cities, so every operation imaginable we have on our campus. Our 10 academic campuses had to manage hundreds of thousands of students and their parents, sending them home, or if they had nowhere to go to, we had to ensure that we could offer safe housing for them. If they stayed on campus, we had to manage healthcare for them. We had to ramp down operations in areas such as athletics. You know, most of our schools are Division I athletics, so ramping down right in the middle of basketball season and managing almost 200,000 employees, sending them home to work remotely for the first time ever, ramping down operations in student affairs, in academics. Our professors were learning to teach remotely. They were learning technology for the first time. And then research. Everybody's research was critical, and telling a primary investigator he needed to go home, that was a challenge, most definitely. In our 5 health systems, you know, we were on the front line just like any other hospital. At one of our medical centers, we had the first US case that was community transmission. So that brought a lot of media attention. So throughout this whole pandemic, we've had to manage the media and the public expectations. Additionally, our technology and research related to COVID is cutting edge. It is pretty exciting to sit on meetings or calls with individuals who are responsible for the cutting edge technology that could improve the testing or bring a vaccine to the pandemic or to the virus. Early in the beginning, we were the hospitals in California receiving patients from repatriation flights. So for a while there, we were the only ones receiving patients from outside of the US. So having to work with the government and the Air Force bases where these repatriation flights landed, the logistics statewide really brought some unique challenges and some really unique learning opportunities. I'll turn it back over to you, Julie.
So Christy, when we were talking about this, you were kind of describing the system as a number of what you'd call almost franchises, right?
Exactly.
So there were all these kind of singular operations in the system. And were you guys able to build any kind of crisis management models for decision making as these things were coming at you?
We were, as you know, in business, a corporation is an easier model to work within when you're at corporate headquarters. When you have a franchise, you have, individual and local autonomy, which does make, managing things like a pandemic a little bit challenging, but it did present a really nice opportunity for us. Each academic campus and the medical centers responded in their own ways. We are spread throughout the entire state of California, so there's local cultures, there's local challenges. We had to follow our local public health, and every county was not the same. So LA County was different than Sacramento County in terms of face coverings and shelter at home when that started. So every location had started to develop their own response plans and their own models for managing the crisis. Our job at the Office of the President was to engage with every location, understand what they were doing, kind of pull from them the best practices and start sharing that with everybody else. So we served as, I guess you could call it, a conduit for information. Anytime anyone had a question, it came to us, and then we put that question out, and we could get information, we could understand best practices and help locations to manage their crisis response model a little bit better.
Christy, do you mind if I ask you what platform you use to kind of communicate those different things and then formulate the best practices? Like a communication platform with your system?
Sure. So we have some that we've used all along. We are still a single enterprise, so we have some internal communication platforms. We have email listservs, we have SharePoint, we have all sorts of technology that we use to share documents or to communicate. But we had crash courses on Slack. I still can't use Slack. But we did everything from phone calls. My phone, I would receive text 24 hours a day. I think that there are more people in the university enterprise that have my personal cell number than ever before. So we used what everybody was comfortable with. We did end up, using some commercial document storage. We ran into issues of access because of IT security. So we had to use some commercial document storage and information storage online. But we, whatever we could do. And then I think we've overutilized Zoom for communication. There probably isn't a person in the university enterprise that doesn't know my office here at home because of Zoom. And so it has been really nice to be on video. It's made folks more comfortable using video, and it's kind of brought us together as well as humans. It's pretty isolating to work from home, especially if you're not used to it. So, the video technology that exists today is kind of nice to bring folks together and allow us not just to communicate about work, but to feel a little bit less isolated at home.
Thanks so much,
Christy.
Christy.
There, Julie.
I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
And I just also want to encourage folks who are attending, if you have questions, please use the Slido platform. We're happy to entertain questions at the latter part of the webinar. So I'm going to turn to you, Mike Schroede. You run a large RRG serving chiropractors, acupuncturists, and massage therapists. I think I got that right.
Yeah.
How did you fill in the gaps when traditional sources of information, leadership shut down and were no longer available?
Well, I think that Christy's absolutely right that this can improve your relationship with your members and your insureds. It can, for a captive or a risk retention group, I think it can dramatically improve. In our case, I believe, and we have done some recent market research, it did improve our relationship. You know, captives and RRGs, we have this trade association-like qualities where sometimes we're an insurance company, but other times we're providing things that traditionally a trade association would provide. And, you know, part of it is whereas a general carrier like an Aetna or Prudential, they're providing multiple lines to multiple groups, but we're often only providing in a single area. And so it's easy to take that on. And, you know, you always have to be careful about whether you're going to make a trade association feel threatened or like you're a competitor, but in other areas it really isn't one and you become the trade association. Well, the facts, as everyone knows, on the ground completely changed when COVID hit, because the trade associations virtually nationwide and in every market sector shut down. And because there was fear and there was no way to get together and they couldn't figure out Zoom or whatever it was. So the normal sources of information and help that existed completely vanished. And in many cases, it's the captives and the RRGs that moved into that void and started providing that information. So for example, on our little spaces, we had, you know, everyone was like, what kind of telemedicine can we do? You know, what's legal to do? What's covered? You know, what does your policy cover for telemedicine? How do you bill for it? And now I'm by trade, I'm a lawyer. So my natural inclination is, well, if we give this out, then we can get sued for it being wrong. But on the other hand, I just made the decision that we were going to take that chance and accept that liability because there was nobody else to help them. And so we became very much during this situation like a trade association. We put out mass emails, you know, put it on Facebook. We did everywhere we could, and we kept stressing, look, this is the only place you're going to get this information, so make sure we're not in your spam filter. And our open rate tripled as a result because people really began to rely on us as the only source. And it wasn't just telemedicine. Medicare changed things about how they were doing it. Now, when the big, first 3 COVID bills went through for the bailout, normally it would have been our trade associations that were lobbying Congress for our members, but they were shut down. So we did it, you know, and there were some unique challenges there because the original version of the bailout bill would have just given unemployment insurance to employees. Well, most of our peeps, they're not employees. They're independent contractors. They're independent business people. So the whole point of our lobbying efforts, you know, were, hey, don't forget about these people. And it worked. I mean, we're not the only reason it worked, but we definitely were a voice for our professions, and our professions got included. And that has dramatically increased. And then the other thing is you got to keep your team together. You know, we have over 100 people, and there are 3 different areas: Arizona, which never shut down; Texas, which only did for a few weeks; and California, which went into a deep shutdown. And so we had to be ready, keep our team intact, because my goal and our goal, which we were successful as, we didn't furlough anybody, we didn't lay anybody off, we didn't cut anybody's wages. And we had set up in California, particularly, everyone's homes ahead of time with, you know, computers and software and whatever they needed for us to continue to function. And we've been doing some marketing surveys over the last couple of weeks. And from what we can tell, this has dramatically improved how we're perceived by our members and insureds. But it's also been crazy. One person commented they feel like it's like they're drinking from a fire hose every day. You know, there's just so much hitting you at once. It's overload. But I think, you know, it's an opportunity, and it's also a crisis, and we've done pretty well with it.
Well, you've just kind of made a testimonial for captives and the benefits that they bring compared to the commercial market.
Yeah.
So, Melissa, I'm going to turn it over to you. You're executive director of an RRG providing medical professional liability insurance.
Right.
You had to quickly address the company's financial considerations in the face of the pandemic, right? Such as premium credits, portfolio impact, and then also you said you really were focused on considering the long view. And can you discuss how you kind of grappled with the immediate issues and then what you see for the future?
Sure. And I would say, like most of us on this panel, we all quickly realized, and Mike, you made a comment, drinking from the fire hose. You have all those issues coming at you every day. Me looking at the operations side of the business, one of my key focuses was making sure that I'm addressing our insured owners and making sure we're responding to them all along while managing these financial impact and the decrease in clinical volumes and how I address that from an exposure perspective. And I will say, I think the key phrase in your question is the long view, because I have really, while I've grappled with all of these issues, I've really, over the last few weeks, taken a step back. And for those listening, I think it'd be really interesting to hear, are they taking a step back? And because I really believe, as I look over the landscape, there are way too many unknowns, just like COVID. There are so many unknowns. I think our captive is going through those same unknowns, trying to figure out, okay, I have this decrease in clinical volumes for my insured, but the telehealth skyrocketed. How do I balance that when I'm looking at an exposure base and rating? And can I really give a premium discount now, not knowing what the claims volume may be in the future? So I've really tried to take a step back. And one of my thoughts on this from a loss perspective and from a financial perspective is make the small tweaks that you can make right now. Don't make any drastic moves as far as huge premium discounts or credits or anything like that, unless your captive can really financially withstand that and your owners need cash. I know some captives have decided to make a dividend distribution or something like that, but I would say over the long view, take a step back and carefully weigh each one of those decisions. And I think we all know in the medical professional liability industry or hospital professional liability, ultimately our loss runs play out the picture. And I personally think that my recommendation to our finance committee and our board, which we have those meetings coming up and there will be so much discussion about this, but is to move slowly and let these loss runs play out. Because we will have time to evaluate, well, did that real decrease in exposures by the reduction in clinical volumes have the significant impact we thought they would, because we're not seeing the losses come in? Or are we seeing all these COVID losses related to maybe I was scheduled for an elective procedure and you couldn't do the procedure. You told me it was fine to wait, but now I'm worse. And you all have all seen all the plaintiff websites. So we know those things are coming, but we just don't know the extent of those yet. So my plan, move slowly. I'm going to let the loss runs play out. And, fortunately for KMRRG, we're in a financial position to be able to do that. I think the only other thing I would add is that I'm in very, very close contact with my portfolio manager. Looking at those reports, obviously for the first quarter, we had a dip, a significant dip, but we've already gone well above and beyond that by tweaking some things. And then I would say if you're not spending money on legal fees or your expenses are down a little bit, go ahead and pump some money over to that portfolio. I know a lot of people say, whoa, wait a minute, this is not the time to be able to do that. But there are some investments that you can make that are safe and can help you weather this. So those are my comments for now, Julie.
Those are great comments, and I would add our portfolio manager says there are quite a few opportunities out there, and it's just great to have trusted service providers having your back on things like this. And the second thing I would say is maybe at some point we could all do what Bill Gates does, which is take a week in the woods and really reflect and create a plan. I know I have that kind of scheduled on my docket as things kind of slow down. So we're going to turn now to demonstrating support to healthcare workers through effective communication and resource provision. So I think Mike touched a little bit on that. I know a lot of the captives have been doing this. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped. I apologize. The next one is recent medical trends, including growth in telehealth, telemedicine, and remote health. We talked a lot about telehealth. And I want to turn to Karen, an important member of our panel, because she represents our wonderful sponsor at Spring Consulting. So Karen, you're on the actuarial and consulting side. And so the pandemic seemed to accelerate certain healthcare trends. For instance, before COVID, only about 8% of Americans use telemedicine. I'm not sure what the figure is globally. I know perhaps in England it's more robust. Then in March and April, some hospitals reported a 700% increase. I actually heard yesterday it's up 11,800%, according to McKnight's. So will telemedicine change the equation?
Yeah, thanks. I think it will. In fact, all the other panelists in some way, shape, or form mentioned telemedicine in their response. As you mentioned, for Medicare beneficiaries, I think that there was about 11,000 people in March using telemedicine, and it's jumped to 1.3 million members, or that 11,000% increase that you mentioned. And what's happened is across the country, obviously HHS has relaxed their standards, and about 37 states have moved to allow it. We're seeing increased use of telemedicine to provide access, definitely in the world of COVID, and that's been an advantage. At the same time, there are other things that people have as concerns, perhaps increased liability because of misdiagnosis and whatnot, because of the inability to really see the patient face to face. I think that one of the other things that has happened beyond telemedicine, that's certainly being one of the top things that's changed during COVID, and some of the panelists touched on it already, is really the view of risk on the whole. It's not just one coverage that's been impacted. I know people have talked about medical malpractice, but it's also other lines of coverage, whether it's workers' comp, healthcare, and a lot of captives that we work with have multiple risks within their captive program. I think it's being heightened because at the same time we have this COVID exposure. We're having trouble in the financial markets, and at their essence, insurance companies make profits or whatnot based on investment and underwriting returns. Well, as the investment returns are more volatile, many of our captives are looking at the underwriting risk, and some of them are seeing profits because of the deferred care and some of the things that were mentioned a little bit earlier. Some are seeing losses, and how to balance it, as Melissa mentioned a little bit earlier, is another significant trend we're seeing in the marketplace. We're seeing a lot of companies look at risk optimization and how they might look at their portfolio on the whole, because what we learned from COVID is it's not about one exposure, it's about multiple exposures changing and morphing at the same time, and how you cope with that and recognize that so you can avoid a black swan event, and either at your institution or at the captive level. How can you view that under a number of different scenarios to make sure there's additional prudence in place? But certainly COVID has accelerated the use of telemedicine. I think it's here to stay, and it remains to be seen. Most states are reimbursing it at the same level as an office visit or whatnot, but there are a few breaking out of the pack that are changing that and reimbursing it at a different level.
So Karen, just to kind of follow up, were you able to cover like other trends that are kind of factoring into changing assumptions about liability related to healthcare? Were you able to cover all those, or did you have any other?
Yeah, I mean, I know we have some questions coming up, but certainly the other trends are things like furloughs and leaves and how those impact the exposures that organizations have. the transition of certain physicians from a surgeon moving to a hospitalist, and how that impacts medical malpractice rates, either for the institution as a whole or for non-employed physicians that might be part of your program. I think those are some of the things that people have to look out for and be aware of as they look at renewing their program, and determining whether or not they are, if they have a profit, going to distribute that profit either as a dividend or as a reduction in premium, or whether they're going to be more conservative about that. We're seeing a lot of people wrestle with just what Melissa mentioned a little bit earlier, the fact that, how do they handle those ebbs and flows? And even though 2019 might look better than, it might look better than it ultimately turns out to be, how do you handle that? How should you look at that risk? And so we think that's a bigger sea change rather than looking line by line. Certainly if we looked line by line, we notice, for example, if you have medical stop loss in your captive program, there's been expansion of coverage on health plan side of the fence. Telemedicine is one, vaccines, preventative care, increased mental health counseling, and that expands the coverage. However, because of the deferred care, we're not seeing the impact that you might think on medical stop loss. Although at the same time, most carriers are increasing rates up to, it varies from a low of a couple of % credit at Kaiser to a high of 14–15% at other health plans. So I do think the impact of COVID for providers as well as employers has been, across most lines. Certainly workers' comp and disability have been impacted. Workers' comp has been impacted because a lot of employers, particularly healthcare workers, have under the employer liability coverage, really a concern that they're going to see increased suits at work. Some states have risen to the occasion to change the laws so that that risk has been minimized or eliminated. At the same time, if we look at the disability side of the fence, if there's a reduction in force, has happened in many clients, they're looking at disability rates increasing, and therefore in the long run, disability costs increasing. So again, depending on what people have in their captive, beyond medical malpractice, professional liability coverages, there's a myriad of related events in the other lines of business. I think a captive can be helpful because it can help bridge some of the gaps that we also see on the coverage side. Business interruption is a good example potentially of that. So at a high level, those are some of the areas that we see changes as a result of COVID.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. So Melissa, I understand that you dealt with numerous issues as these new trends kind of emerged. There were coverage questions. They weren't only related to telehealth, but also to clinical trials for COVID treatments, apparently, and testing and reactivating retired healthcare providers. Can you tell us how some of these scenarios played out?
Sure, and I think someone's already referenced this, but I think this speaks to the real beauty of a captive insurance company, because you can be nimble. And historically, our policy language has been fairly broad. So we were able to quickly address questions coming in as telemedicine, telehealth covered under my policy, or clinical trials covered under my policy. We've never had exclusions in our policies related to those types of exposures. However, I've always done detailed underwriting. And I think that as I've gone through this, the underwriting for those areas will become even more detailed. It's sort of highlighted some things we needed to do in our underwriting practices. For instance, you know, if you call about a clinical trial, I've always had a supplemental application that you would complete. What I'm interested in is, okay, what level are you participating in that clinical trial? Are you the principal investigator? Or are you just a site subject, or a subject site where you're going to maybe administer, but you don't have any other exposure in that clinical trial? So I think overall, my comment would be that, you know, it's the beauty of the captive. We've been able to respond to the needs of our policyholders and our insured owners by being flexible in addressing the coverage that they need. We've had some executive orders in Kentucky, like most states have had, that are providing some protections related to off-label use of medications, bringing back retired providers, all of those things. I don't know if those things will ultimately play out, because if you read the fine print, it always refers to reasonableness, standard of care, sort of language. So, you know, we'll just be in for the long haul to provide the coverage there for our insureds. And you know, I think it signals to us, though, what our underwriting practices will need to be as we work through this next renewal cycle for 2021.
It seems like you're highlighting the underlying theme of, you know, the idea that from catastrophe can come positive change, that we can see areas where we can improve, and these kind of events shine a light on that for sure. So we're going to turn now to demonstrating support to healthcare workers through effective communication resource provision. So Mike, you touched on this a little bit. It sounds like you're a fantastic resource, not only for your member insureds, but also true to you, to the entire industry. So you guys had a rapid response at Allied that demonstrated, you know, support of your insureds, and many were forced into hiatus, I understand. So what means of quick and effective mass communication and individual, I assume sometimes, did you use in your company?
Well, I completely agree with the point that Melissa made about the magic of being a captive in RRG, because you have you don't just have a relationship with your member insureds, but you also have the ability to shape what the risk is going to look like go forward because of your relationship and how you communicate. So, for example, we're communicating now to 75–80% of our industry for a while was completely shut down, and they were facing very devastating economic things. And the number one thing that dominates the insurance industry right now and the sectors that we serve is fear. And how do you address that? And at the same time, you can shape the risk go forward. So, for example, one of the things we needed to address was, when do you reopen? And ultimately, we stress, look, it's a personal choice, but here's the government orders, here's what you're looking at, and then how do you reopen? Because you can shape when you put that out there, you can shape the risk that you're going to end up with based on what you tell them about what steps, what personal protective gear do you use, what do you do in your waiting room, you know, all of these things, and then if you think ahead of it, well, what are they going to have to prove to make a claim? Because it's not just that they can't just say, I got COVID there, for example. They have to show that that out of the 137 people they ran into last month, they got it from our particular provider, and they got it in a way that fell below the standard of care. So that allows us to say, well, if you do this and this and this, even if they could somehow prove they got it there, they didn't get it while it was below the standard of care. So you know, we can shape that. We also ramped up beyond a level that we've ever done before, individual communications. We talked to every single person who wasn't renewing. We talked to them. We got them on the phone. We emailed them, whatever, text them, whatever it took to find them, and asked what was going on. They said, well, I don't have any patients. Okay, well, you know, under your policy, you can get a 60-day leave if you don't have any patients, and then, you know, you just don't owe us anything for 60 days. Oh, okay. You know, or we say, Well, I've ratcheted down. I only have a few now. Well, okay, well, we can support you with that too. You can, under your policy, you can go to part-time for 60 days, and then it'll just reboot itself. And so, in terms of March numbers, you know, we have 153,000 insureds. Now, they're all little policies, you know, little businesses, but we lost 42 to non-renewal in March and 19 in April. Now, we also probably have a 3 to 4% dip in overall premiums because of, you know, the leave periods and the this and the that, but it really worked out. But the other thing is, if you're going to take a look at reshaping the risk, if you rethink each area of your captive, so for example, claims are just, the world has changed. You know, you had a situation where all the courts were closed. My belief is it'll be another year or two when things reopen in terms of everything getting stacked up before you can do anything. So why not increase communication to the claimants and the claimants' lawyers? And we contacted them and said, look, here's the program. It's going to be a year or two before anyone sees a courtroom. Why don't we pretend we're 2 weeks from trial and try to settle now? And it has worked. Not in every case, but we normally manage about 600-ish claims, open claims at any given month. In the month of March, that dropped on a net basis by 51, and it dropped by 22 in April. That's a big drop for us. And so we were able to settle a lot more claims, and then we're preparing our defenses now. If we get COVID claims, what are they going to look like, and what do we need to do? Like, what experts do we need? What do we need for that? So we're reaching out to both the other side, if you will, our own people on a mass communications and individualized communications.
That's excellent. Thanks, Mike. And I really think that all those multiple strategies are really important. As everybody said, you've got to kind of cross all platforms and address these type of situations. So I do again want to encourage folks to ask questions on Slido. We'll get to those in the last 10 minutes of the session. Now we're going to turn to liability concerns and supporting the management of medical claims and workers' compensation. So I think Mike gave us a great intro into that. Christy, what do you perceive as your most significant exposures in the UCal system and emanating from the pandemic? Christy, I think you need to unmute.
You are exactly right. I did need to. I almost never do that either. You know, Julie, I don't think we know yet, to be honest. I think there's still a lot we don't know about COVID, and one of those is long-term effects. At the University of California, fortunately, we have not had a tremendous amount of COVID-related claims to date, especially in our healthcare settings. You know, our hospitals employ over 100,000 individuals, and we've had very few claims, I think, relative to one, the volume of employees that we have, but also the cutting edge where we live. In, you know, some of the things that I addressed earlier or shared earlier, you know, the cutting edge research and having received patients from the repatriated flights and being, you know, the first to have a community transmission case. You know, the public health physicians didn't treat that individual as being COVID positive because there was no community transmission. So when you're in the front line and your public health officer says there's no, that they don't believe that they are a COVID patient, you know, I think that speaks a lot to our infection prevention efforts. It speaks a lot to our employee safety and our PPE and the efforts that we took to protect our employees. So I think we are managing our current, but we don't know about our future. The other thing we don't know, you know, is our patients. So, you know, we kind of, who's ever heard of a hospital shutting down? But we essentially did, except for critical and life-saving operations. I think it was Melissa that mentioned earlier that elective procedures were put on hold. we had to have urgent procedures put on hold. So not only, if you were waiting to have your knee replaced, was that put on hold, but even more urgent medical procedures were put on hold. So I think the unknown as well, and just to reiterate what Melissa had said earlier was, how are those cases today? So if you were to have your knee replaced back in February and now it's June, how is your knee and what's your outcome going to be like? So I think we have to look at it two different ways. One is the workers' comp cases related to COVID, but also the management of our medical cases and our patients' cases that may have been impacted by the pandemic and delayed, the medical treatment delayed by the pandemic. And so I think our most significant exposure is unknown, and I think we'll see that in the next few years.
Thanks, Christy. It is interesting because I heard a commentator say recently, anybody who's talking about what the future holds with absolute certainty is someone you shouldn't listen to.
Exactly. I do believe our greatest vulnerability is coming. Whatever that looks like, I don't know. And it may be insignificant, but broad. But I think, fortunately, I'm comfortable with the way that our cases are managed right now, but the future is unknown. And like you said, anyone who claims to know it, you shouldn't trust.
Right, exactly. So we've got about 10 minutes left. And Melissa, did you want to touch a little bit on how your CAPT is managing claims? I know we've talked about a few things, but we haven't talked, you mentioned a little bit about the healthcare immunity. Did you want to touch on that a little bit more?
Just, I'll make a couple of comments. My short deposition answer is yes. We've made many changes, but I think just things that we are considering. And Mike, I think you mentioned this, working on those claims that you may have an immediate settlement, looking at your low-hanging fruit. I know personally I've completed a Zoom mediation that was very successful. I had low exposure in the case, but the other co-defendants did not, but we all agreed and it was a successful mediation. The case got resolved. The other things we're considering, and that I made really a clear decision and communicated to all of our defense counsel. I really don't want you doing any work on any of our cases unless it's essential work, because we're looking at all the impact of the legal fees. And one thing I want to make sure everybody's turned their attention to, law firms, because of the court closures, are struggling. And I know that what I have seen personally is, for instance, you may see a partner billing on a medical chronology hours and hours and hours, where previously you may have had a paralegal doing that. So looking at your legal bills very closely for those firms or lawyers that are still doing work that is considered to be essential, although I don't consider a medical chronology essential right now, but just kind of start looking at those things in our legal fee management, because I think that our challenge will be, I know our last executive order stated that we would have no jury trials. Well, it said no sooner than August 1st. But then 3 pages of that executive order discussed how we might bring juries back to the courtroom with virtual orientations and, all these other things. And of course, you've got all the criminal cases that will come before these med mal cases. So I think it's going to be a long time. Mike, you referred to that. It will be a long time before I think we get into the courtroom. So start looking at other ways you may be able to get your cases resolved. The other thing that I'm looking at is virtual depositions. I know many of the law firms previously really didn't like that idea. They felt it was more important to get in the room with that expert witness or the plaintiff or whatever. And now I'm hearing a little bit different of a story. It's like, well, maybe that is a good idea. And I said, well, I've been talking about these virtual depositions for years so I can cut down on my legal fees and travel expenses, and no. And now it's a good idea. But I do think it's a good idea in some cases. So really just looking at all aspects of how this will impact our litigation. And I think to wrap that up, another point I would throw out there that we are looking very closely at, Mike, your loss run sounds fairly robust. Mine's not as robust, not because of losses, but probably our insured base is smaller. But looking at once all of those trials start to be rescheduled, you're going to have 4 or 5, maybe 10 trials stacked on top of each other. And depending on what kind of legal fees you expect to see in a quarter, you may want to start taking a good look at that to see if we can, how are we going to budget for that? And looking at, I've never sent a trial calendar to get a trial date with any of my defense lawyers, but it may be necessary so that our claims staff aren't overloaded with trying to monitor 3, 4, 5 trials at a time and can still be able to do their job effectively. So I'll stop there because I know we have a time limit, but just throwing out some things I think we all need to be thinking about from that litigation perspective.
Thanks, Melissa. So I think we have a couple other areas. I think a lot of people might be interested in increasing business intelligence and reaping the benefits of data analytics for improved risk management. Karen, that's your territory, right? The industry had become educated on the new realities of the pandemic. How did your clients increase their business intelligence?
Certainly, they've increased business intelligence by paying attention to industry resources, looking at state regulations, their own loss experience, and monitoring that as a bare minimum. One of the things I think they've had to become smart about as COVID has impacted us is really taking a look at their cash flow now and the cash flow in the future. We've had some healthcare organizations that participate in risk related strategies with regards to Medicare and Medicaid. And basically what's happened is they've seen a big shift of patients from commercial to Medicare, Medicaid, either because of furloughs, retirements, changes in the workforce. And I think they've become smart because they realize their risk is shifting. They've paid more attention to their losses now. And they're looking, as many people have indicated, to try and get a handle on what the deferred care impact might be in the future. I mean, no one really knows what that might look like, but it's impacting cash flow, certainly on the healthcare institution currently, but in the long run, is there going to be pent-up demand, lots of claims, increased liability as a result of the deferred care? And so they're trying to look at multiple scenarios by risk modeling, looking at what if scenarios. We're doing quite a bit on risk optimization, looking at what can they do to minimize their risk. And at the same time, we're seeing organizations reach for some of the reserves and surplus that the captive has built up over the course of time. We have one client that's had good experience in 2019, would likely have paid a dividend, but wonders if, 2020, wonders if some of that really should be held, as has been said, as a reserve for future things that might impact the organization most greatly. So I think looking at predictive modeling around doing multiple risk scenarios, looking at risk correlation, looking at the impact of deferred care on all the different lines of business they have in their captive. And I think one of the great things about captives is that you could have one line in profit, another in loss. It can help an organization offset the impact of one line versus another. And we see our clients wanting to take advantage of that savings and to the extent possible, minimize the overall organization's cash flow implications to some degree, whether it's a holiday. I don't think anyone's really going down the road of, none of our clients are really being cautious because no one knows what the future might hold. So I think looking at their losses, looking at actuarial modeling, looking at the regulatory environment, trying to address some of the low-hanging fruit, the cases and so forth, determining how people will return to work to mitigate their increase in workers' compensation claims. I know some organizations we work with have just said, we're not really going to worry about workers' comp. We need people at work. We can't really deal with that now. The captives are now paying for specialists to look at how to get people back to work in that environment. So I think people are getting smart by looking at all of those different resources that they have at their disposal. And depending on when the captive has a renewal date and has to communicate either to the healthcare system or non-employed physicians or whoever else they might cover, if they have a health plan, I think that they're trying to balance all of those and develop a picture line by line as well as on a total basis.
Okay, so you kind of set us up for the future. Mike, can you do it in a minute? Because we want to look at, I feel like with the breadth of your experience, you really have a keen eye for spotting industry trends. So can you give us a quick thing on, do you see increased interest in captives and this space as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic?
It's always a dangerous thing to ask a lawyer to be quick, but yes, I do. There's three factors that are in play right now, all of which are very much make captives, either increasing the size of a captive or a new captive, become very attractive. One is markets were hardening before this hit, and hard markets breed a need for captives. Now we overlay fear, which is a defining emotion right now, and we overlay decreased economic activity because of the shutdowns. And things you couldn't get done before, you can get done now. As Julie knows, I've been working on launching a program to provide property to captives and RRGs for about 3 years. Well, guess what? We launched it during COVID because everybody I needed to talk to was available. They weren't doing anything else. You're going to see programs that come out for business interruption. You're going to see programs that come out for pandemic covers. You're going to see programs to come out to replace carriers that are going to get buried by claims in different areas. So those kinds of opportunities are there right now. Opportunities to expand what you're doing and to provide new covers. And it's the three normal drivers that make things captive and RRG friendly. All of them exist right now.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. And thanks to all our panelists. We really appreciate your contribution. We are going to go to the Q&A portion. Do we have any questions on Slido? Let's see. Okay, let's start from the top. Christy, do you think that the captive has worked when it comes to dealing with COVID implications? Were there any gaps that emerged? Uh-oh, you got to unmute again.
I did it twice in one day.
It's
not
early,
unmuting.
It's early.
My defense is that it's not even 8 o'clock. Yes, that is a really good question. And unfortunately, I'm not the one to be able to address that. I am not directly involved with our captive. And, I'm the operations, safety, risk management in healthcare. So unfortunately, I don't feel like I can address that question fairly.
No problem. Do any of the other panelists feel like they could take that on, or should we move on to the next question?
I mean, I'll just comment briefly that I think some of the comments that we've gotten from the panel really speak to the fact that captives, I think, more effective than general carriers, have addressed information gaps and coverage gaps, where they've gone out proactively. Like Melissa said, look, we covered telemedicine. We went out with information saying, here's how telemedicine works. So I think captives, much more so than general carriers, have addressed this.
Thanks, I would add, Julie, I was just going to add one more point to that. I see every day some of the commercial carriers posting exclusions. So I think as those exclusions build for those commercial carriers in our industry, those are the things that we'll be looking at to say, hey, on the captive side, we have covered those or we can cover those.
Yeah, and I just wanted to echo that as well. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, we've seen captives hire return to work folks specifically to address COVID when the organization was eliminating positions so that they could minimize claims but effectively get people back to work. And it was really the captive that had the resources that enabled the organization to do that. So I think they can fill a lot of gaps that traditional carriers can't fill, and probably that organizations don't have a specific line of sight to.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, how do healthcare captives change with an industry that changes so often? Anybody want to take this one on?
I know that we've had healthcare captives we work with that have adopted policies, differences in conditions policies, are a good example where we've had situations where the healthcare captive didn't have an exposure that was covered, didn't really know the extent of the exposure, but knew that the organization was going to have to pick it up out of general assets, and developed a differences in conditions policy from their underlying coverage to cover the gaps that the underlying coverage couldn't fill. I think that captives have always been organizations that are flexible, can implement new policies relatively easily versus the commercial market that might take 90 days to get a form approved. So they're a lot more flexible, a lot more resilient, a lot more responsive to specific healthcare organizations' needs. And I think we're seeing it during COVID.
Yes, for sure. And I would also add that I feel like in our industry, we're always monitoring changes and trends, and we're always reviewing our policies, our applications, all of those systems on a regular basis. They're always open to change and becoming better. And oftentimes that is as a result of perhaps a highly litigated coverage question or other matters. So there's many places you can find where the changes are happening and address them. And kudos to Mike's program, who had all those opportunities in their policies already in terms of hiatus and part-time and things like that. I would say that's a trend that folks should follow right behind you, because I wouldn't have thought of those until COVID, but that certainly makes a lot of sense.
And what was interesting about that is most of our insureds didn't even know about it, which was on us in terms of not necessarily, at least up till this point, being very good communicators. When we said, oh, by the way, you have this, they go, I do, and it was a little bit of an embarrassment that they didn't know.
Although I would say with insurance, we can all admit we're in the industry, we don't know the ins and outs of every one of our policies. And the great thing about having insurance is that you call and yes, you're covered. And so the communication is there when it needs to be, because that's when people really wake up to all of the ins and outs of their policy.
Right, when it matters, because most people, including me, I don't read my insurance policies.
Right, exactly. So we've got a few minutes left, and we have one last question. What lessons have been learned regarding reopening as businesses reopen or prepare to reopen? I know, Mike, you did talk about that a little bit, I feel like, and Christy, maybe one of you guys want to tackle that.
I'll let Christy go first.
Okay, I'll take this one since I had to defer the question directed to me. How's that? But we're starting to open back up. And so, these lessons are ongoing. I think that the one is, crisis brings everybody together, right? So take advantage of that. Learn from each other. Beg, borrow, steal from one another in the good sense. That's what we have learned to do is, and I don't know how other states are opening back up, but it might have been Mike mentioned, California, we went into hibernation here. We went into deep, shelter at home shutdown. And so our governor has a very detailed plan on opening California back up. there are a lot of new requirements. Counties had to apply to open back up. The state had to review our status. They looked at our cases, our number of cases, our rates, our deaths. Businesses had to have COVID plans and COVID training in place before they could open back up. And I really commend the state of California for putting in the effort and laying out a plan. I think a plan in place and having criteria met before you open up is probably the safest way to do it, to avoid, additional surges and keep our cases low. So I think that having a plan, not just opening up because you feel like you need to. We all need to. We need to get our economy going again, but having a plan, having met criteria, and sharing business practices and sharing lessons learned and sharing best practices among businesses.
That sounds like a great moment to end on. Mike, if you're okay with that.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who attended and the wonderful panelists who provided so much valuable information, and also to Captive Review, who has provided this platform for these symposiums that have been a fantastic way to share information and, as Christy said, so we can all collaborate. Thank you so much. Lauren?
Thank you to everyone on the panel, and thank you, Julie, for being our moderator. This was, I think, a really educational thing for a lot of people. I just want to thank everyone for attending and remind everyone we've got our US Captive Summit virtual edition, which is going to be on the 9th of July. So please, if you're interested, go to the website or email us. It's going to be a really great kind of half-day summit. So thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.